Hello everyone. Well, with 2 seasons worth of rankings under my trench coat belt, that line would work much better if Columbo's trench coat, and mine for that matter, had a belt. With 2 ranking videos successfully completed, I'm back to dive into the 3rd season of Columbo. For this season, I am making one change to the ranking formula, and that is, I will only be examining 4 categories for scoring: the killer, the guest starring ensemble, the crime itself, and the spectacular conclusions to each episode. That's not to say I won't be discussing the Columbo character or Peter Falk's performances, but my shtick of giving him a perfect score each time might be running a little thin. I'll still give him the appropriate praise that he deserves and mention other thoughts I had in general about the episode. The 4 remaining categories will still be graded out of 5, with the final score being out of 20. Now, without further ado, let's get underway. The season opener is lovely but lethal. Written by Jackson Gillis and directed by Jeannot Swark. The murderer that started the snowball of crime rolling in the fall of 1973 was Vera Miles, playing the renowned beauty product mogul Vivica Scott. Miss Scott murders a chemist at her company, who also just so happens to be a former boyfriend of hers when he dares to offer the formula for a groundbreaking, miraculous wrinkle cream to a rival company. Vera Miles is an actress that I have enjoyed forever, from The Searchers, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Hitchcock films like The Wrong Man, and that one with the creepy guy in the shower, and any number of television appearances on every classic show. She's extremely talented, and I was very excited to see her name in the opening credits. But this character is just alright. There are aspects to Vivica Scott that I really like. She's obviously supposed to be this beauty industry icon, and she's fashioned an image for herself that everyone will remember. The large red wig, and her beauty mark, which is the name of her company, and the way in which she plays early scenes, especially one opposite the other huge guest star for the episode, and the cool facade that she puts up once Columbo starts nosing around. All of that worked extremely well. But very quickly after that, the character becomes just a collection of, already at this point, standard Columbo villain traits. The impatience, the yelling at Columbo when he keeps hanging around, and then flipping to brief moments of relief when it seems he isn't finding any hard evidence, which you could argue he doesn't always do. None of those things are bad, but when we've seen them done quite a few times at this point, it's nice when there's a little more to the murderer. Her performance is as good as it can be with what she had to work with, so Vera Miles gets 3 out of 5. Vincent Price leads the roster of supporting character guest stars this time, and he is, as expected, perfect in his scenes. He's playing that rival company owner that I mentioned earlier, and is an excellent adversary for Vera Miles. But for some strange reason, he's only in, I think, 2 scenes, which seems like such a waste to me. His first one is a fun, snide standoff with Vera Miles at a fashion show, and the second is his being questioned by Columbo, in which he does some very cool under pressure lying. And the murder victim is a very young Martin Sheen. His character of the duplicitous chemist working behind his boss's back is interesting in that it's hard to nail down his true intentions. Is he doing this to finagle a partnership with Vivica Scott, or is he truly just doing this out of vengeance after she discarded him like many other boyfriends over the years? And finally, Cyan Barbara Allen plays Vincent Price's secretary, who is actually a chain-smoking corporate spy for Vivica Scott. She's good, and plays the role as perhaps not as bright as she believes herself to be, as she doesn't realize that her life may end around the time her usefulness to Miss Scott does. It's a good little ensemble, sorely in need of more Vincent Price, and one that gets 3 out of 5. The murder scene stands out because of how impromptu it is. Vera Miles goes to Martin Sheen's house to try and get the miracle cream formula from him, or at least the sample he's hidden, and their conversation spirals out of control until she smashes a microscope over his head. The tension building throughout is very well handled, and is one of the few second-degree murders we've seen so far on Columbo. She doesn't move the body, doesn't try to frame anyone else, just wipes down everything she touched and flees the scene. And there is a second murder, where she kills Cyan Barbara Allen through the use of a drugged cigarette. As if there weren't enough reasons to give up smoking. You never know when a beauty mogul with a knowledge of chemistry is going to give you a laced coffin nail just before you go for a cruise down a winding mountain road. Both crimes and the scenes leading up to them are unique and first-rate, 4 out of 5. The finale is one of those that left me wanting, shall we say. Throughout the episode, Columbo and Vivica Scott are continually scratching at their hands. And basically, that's all Columbo talks about. What is it? It feels like poison ivy, which doesn't grow in Southern California. He gets tested, and it is poison ivy. This goes on for quite some time, while Vivica nervously scratches at her hands between Columbo run-ins until the final shoe drops. The murderer brained poor Martin Sheen with a microscope, which was holding a slide with a sample of poison ivy on it. This tiny slide broke on the carpet, and both Vivica and Columbo happened to kneel on the same spot, placed their hands on the same area where this slide shattered, and contracted poison ivy. There was also a broken drinking glass on the floor as well, but they managed to avoid that. The poison ivy slide is just a hand magnet, apparently. It just feels like a clue that should be the first thing that clues him into her guilt, not the final gotcha where they snap on the handcuffs. And there's no clue or mention of the secretary's murder. I guess we just have to hope that Vivica confesses to that one down the line. 2 out of 5. This episode was written by Jackson Gillis, who is responsible for some of the best writing of this show so far, like Suitable for Framing, and also the worst of this show, like Short Fuse. And then there are middling episodes he did, like Requiem for a Falling Star. Lovely But Lethal definitely falls into the middle, maybe a little lower than that category. I think the biggest problem, outside of the finale, is that it feels lifeless to me. Columbo isn't given much humor, and if some of it was intended to be funny, it fell flat for me. Humor is a huge part of this show, in my opinion, and the episodes I've enjoyed the most have got suspense, a real mystery of how he's going to solve the case in a satisfying way, and laughs. And this one had not much of any of that. The locations are great, though. In particular, the Fat Farm, their words, not mine, designed like some sort of Eastern palace. I also like the headquarters for Beauty Mark Cosmetics, all very sleek and white, and also the setting for the laced cigarette scene on the beach with waves crashing behind them. All in all, not a great episode, and an odd choice for the season premiere. Any Old Port in a Storm was the second episode this season, written by Stanley Ross and Larry Cohen, and directed by Leo Penn. Donald Pleasence finds himself under Columbo's intense scrutiny this time around, playing Adrian Carsini, a vineyard owner who kills his half-brother when he learns their property is about to be sold to a rival company. Carsini is a somewhat unusual character in the pantheon of Columbo villains. And the reason I say that is because of how remarkably controlled he is when it comes to his being under suspicion, at least. When it comes to his favorite hobby, not so much.
An exciting meal has been ruined by the presence of this liquid filth.
But otherwise, he doesn't really let his mask slip, and is more than happy to spend time with Columbo, educating him and appreciating Columbo's growing knowledge of the wine business. Donald Pleasence is very good in the role, and especially in the scene leading up to the murder, escalates the anger and tension very quickly. The way sibling jealousy and long unsettled grievances come to light during an argument. And he's also perfectly cast as a pretentious, arrogant man who has only one true love, and it's stored in his cellar. And I'm not talking about his brother, who spends his final agonizing days there. 4 out of 5. The supporting cast is one of the weaker ones, in my opinion. Gary Conway plays the younger brother, and of course the victims in this show aren't around for that long, but typically they're able to make more of an impression than he does. He's a money-hungry playboy, and he plays that fine, I suppose. Dana Elcar, good old Pete Thornton of MacGyver fame, shows up as another wine enthusiast, but doesn't have much to do. Joyce Gilson plays Gary Conway's fiancée, and other than bringing Columbo into the case in the first place, doesn't really figure into the story in a big way. Julie Harris probably makes the biggest impression as Donald Pleasence's long-suffering assistant, struggling with her apparent unrequited love for him. She's very convincing as a stern, logical woman who is in some ways the opposite of her employer, but is able to keep his affairs in order as he spends inordinate sums of money building up his collection. For her sake, I'll give the side characters 2 out of 5, which I know isn't much. I much prefer when there are an abundance of old Hollywood stars ambling through an episode, and I'm sure my ratings typically bear that out when that's the case. The murder scene is quite good. As I said, the conversation illustrates the strained relationship of the Carsini brothers very nicely, and when it suddenly builds to the initial attack, achieved via blunt instrument, it's startling and nicely handled. But that's not the main point of interest. Adrian's plan is to leave his brother, groggy but still alive, in the wine cellar, with the air conditioning turned off, and then go on a week-long trip to New York to make unfunny jokes amongst pompous crowds to their adoring laughter, a la the art show in Suitable for Framing. When he returns, he dresses his brother's body in a wetsuit, then leaves him in the ocean to be eventually found. And this all presents a few questions for me. First of all, the whole thing with the wetsuit, wouldn't rigor mortis have set in during the 5 days between his death and Adrian's return? So how exactly did he stretch this rubber suit over him? Or things could have been much worse as we learned the insane temperatures that were experienced in that cellar. Also, if someone died on a Tuesday while scuba diving, which is what the police are meant to believe, wouldn't his body show some signs of having been in the water for that long when it's found on the following Sunday or Monday? Both of these things kind of bothered me, especially when a key element of what makes Columbo suspicious is based on the autopsy findings. I'm not sure if these questions are all that valid, since I'm no expert on body decomposition in water, and I'm not sure that I want to learn. But finally, the biggest question I had, right from the moment it happened, is surrounding Adrian's turning off the air conditioning. And this plays into the finale as well. If Adrian's whole life, his entire world, is based around his love of rare and expensive wines, why would this slip his mind when he thinks of turning off the air conditioning to kill his brother? You could argue that he's caught up in the moment, his adrenaline pumping, but I don't really buy that. Again, wine is all he thinks about, and he's installed an air conditioning unit that he stresses is on at all times. Why would he jeopardize his collection for this? That would be like a person with a movie collection hiding a dead body amongst the shelving and then burning down the room to conceal a crime. I'm not sure why I thought of that example. Anyway, I liked the initial argument scene, but the rest brought me down to 2 out of 5. The finale, as I mentioned, surrounds Columbo discovering that the collection has been ruined by the extreme temperatures that the cellar rose to. When the restaurant scene happened, I began to get nervous. I was thinking, oh no, I hope Columbo isn't just getting this idea based on the spoiled bottle that is brought to them in the restaurant. Hopefully, Columbo supplied them that bottle beforehand, taken from the Carsini cellar. Don't let this be a coincidence, don't let this be a coincidence. And it wasn't. He catches Adrian in the act of destroying the rest of the evidence, and the two share a very calm and collected scene before Columbo drives him away. The scene works, and the friendship of sorts that they forged plays out even as Adrian's about to be arrested. The same thing with Adrian agreeing to go for supper with Columbo. I can't imagine any of the other killers thus far agreeing to a meal with the good lieutenant. Their dynamic and the well-plotted ending bring this to a 4 out of 5. This is, I believe, the first time we've seen Columbo in his office. And it's also a rare occasion where Columbo is brought into a case before the murder has been discovered. Rick Carsini was likely dead by the time his fiancée contacted Columbo, but no one knew that at the time. It's very interesting seeing Columbo not on a case, without any of the artifice that he puts up when speaking with suspects. When Columbo talks with the fiancée, he's very businesslike, directing her to missing persons, but finally agrees to look into the matter because he's a good guy, of course. Peter Falk is very interesting in these scenes, playing Columbo very straight without any of the down-home humor or absent-mindedness. This is the most noticeable episode so far, where Columbo is continually looking for a pen, a pencil, whatever you got, and his notepad is hauled out to panic the lying people he's speaking with several times. And, drumroll please, Columbo apparently has a child, or maybe even multiple children. He makes reference to needing a babysitter a couple of times, and this just shocked me. Lieutenant Columbo has never struck me as the fatherly type, and I at the same time would love to see that depicted on screen, and also, I really don't want to see it. I'd prefer to dream up these shaggy-haired, mumbly kids in my mind and leave it at that. The episode is one of those hour and 35-minute ones, and I know there are more coming down the line, but I just have to say, I'm not a fan of that. The hour and a quarter runtime is perfect for Columbo. Those episodes are typically tight, nicely paced mysteries that never stop moving, and the longer ones like this oftentimes just feel slower. I won't pinpoint any particular scene that dragged, but after you pass the hour mark, in my mind I just naturally expected that the noose was going to really tighten around Carsini's neck. But then it keeps going for a while. The main stumbling block for this episode is that it centers on the wine business. I have zero interest in the wine business, or wine, or alcohol, frankly. So that probably contributed to this one feeling a little overlong. Hi, I'm Nelson Hayward, and as your senator, I promise I'll be tough on crime. Any and all crimes not committed by Nelson Hayward. I'm Nelson Hayward, and I approve this message. Candidate for Crime is up next, written by Irving Perlberg, Alvin R. Friedman, Roland Kibbe, and Dean Hargrove, from a story by Larry Cohen and directed by Boris Sagal. Well, after a somewhat shaky first couple episodes, Season 3 finally hits its stride. Jackie Cooper plays the aforementioned Nelson Hayward, a politician running for the Senate who murders his campaign manager before he can spoil his little romance he's got going with his wife's secretary. And can I just say, Jackie Cooper is perfect casting for a role like this. He's middle-aged, maybe not the most handsome man in the world, like most real-life politicians, but with his broad, white smile, blow-dried hair, and tailored suits, he's got the perfect look. His backslapping demeanor, tendency to throw himself into the grief-stricken friend role a little too heartily, everything is letter perfect. He's a great foil for Columbo, and is given the usual murderer trait for trying too hard to explain away the holes in his plot that Columbo brings up. And having the episode focus around a campaign like this allows the show to visit locations and circumstances we haven't seen yet. The campaign offices with phones ringing off the hook, holding back the gaggle of reporters, shooting an ad where he talks about being tough on crime. All of that is great stuff. And I love the line where he looks at Columbo following another conversation filled with hints toward his guilt and says, "I like to win," accompanied by that big smile. 5 out of 5. The ensemble around him is filled with characters that all make their mark and stand out in the time they're given. Joanne Linville plays Hayward's wife. Their marriage, we learn before even meeting her, is on uneven ground. Following the murder, Hayward tries hard to seem like the devoted husband, getting her involved in his campaigns just like they used to, and Joanne Linville plays this character, struggling with alcoholism, with a degree of hope tempered with the doubt she has about her husband's fidelity. And the scene where she calls out the act he puts on around everyone, including herself, is wonderful. Tisha Sterling stars as Hayward's girlfriend, a naive, gullible young woman that somehow believes she won't be tossed aside like his wife has been. She's so earnest in her scenes, and manages to wither under Columbo's questioning very well, while still giving the impression of trying to hold it together, no matter how obvious it is that Columbo knows the truth. And Ken Swofford plays Harry Stone, the campaign manager gunned down so unceremoniously by Hayward. He's excellent, as this gruff, smug political operator that believes and says aloud that he's the brains behind Nelson Hayward. That relationship, one of the supposed underling holding the real power, is developed so well in just one scene. And it's fascinating watching Hayward be the jovial leader of the people while in the hallway, but then transform into the put-upon mouthpiece of his staff when he enters his hotel room. 4 out of 5 for this set of supporting characters. The murder is quite well handled. I like the car switching and developing essentially 2 plans, one to trick Harry Stone and the cops, and another to get away with the murder. And I really like the fake-out where it appears Hayward's wife is next on the hit list, but instead is just the beginning of a surprise party in her honor. It's not a perfect murder and isn't necessarily the most elaborate crime, but it really works. 4 out of 5. The finale is a great one because of how it deviates from the Columbo formula. Typically, and in the best cases I love this, the rug is pulled out using some small thing that was established early in the episode and was just lying under ours and the killer's noses. But here, there are so many clues that spring up throughout the episode. The positioning of the supposed cars during the crime, the broken watch securing the time of death, the phone call that was placed far too soon after the killing, the new tailored jacket that was ordered before the old one was spoiled by bullet holes. I'm sure there's more. But all of these are discarded when Hayward makes one more mistake, faking another attempt on his life. That moment, when Columbo tells him there's no bullet in the wall, is a thing of beauty. Jackie Cooper's face is set in this mask of dread as he realizes everything that he set up was pointless. The setting at the party, normally a triumphant moment for winning politicians, is perfect as his life changes forever, just not in the way he expected. I'm very happy they didn't use the broken watch as a crucial bit of evidence, as the leap from sturdy shoes and durable jackets to suspecting his watch was changed out by the killer was a bit of a stretch. Regardless, All these clues are just used to firmly establish Hayward as the killer in Columbo's mind, but the coup de grace is down to ballistics, and I'm sure the gun in his briefcase could be secured by a warrant shortly thereafter. 4 out of 5. One thing that bothered me though, I was hoping they would have shown some clever way Hayward had devised of disposing of the remains of the firecracker he used to simulate a gunshot, because I'm thinking that would be found in a real big hurry by someone. Not even necessarily someone as brilliant as Lieutenant Columbo. But alas, they didn't, and jumped ahead to the excellent gotcha moment. Now, I realize I just got through complaining about the extended runtime of Any Old Port in a Storm, and I also realize that Candidate for Crime is technically even longer at an hour 38. But I love this one. The dentist scene with Columbo's complaining Italian dentist, the extended checkup that Highway Patrol performs on Columbo's car, Columbo pulling his just one more thing routine about 5 times in Hayward's office. All of this could be tightened, but I'm glad they didn't, because these interludes are very charming. But the best of the bunch is the sequence at the tailor shop, where Columbo faces off with the owner, played by Vito Scotti. The entire conversation, with Columbo's pretense of needing a new jacket for some unnamed affair on the weekend, is a blast and is hilarious. And lastly, I loved how Peter Falk plays the scenes as Hayward's story is falling apart. Normally, Columbo continues to appear oblivious to the guilt before him until the end. But this time, you could really see that slipping, and Columbo's cunning rising to the fore. Another phenomenal performance. Episode 4 brings us to Double Exposure, written by Stephen J. Cannell and directed by Richard Quine. Robert Culp returns for his 3rd appearance as a cold-blooded killer, this time playing an expert in motivational research that murders a wealthy man that isn't proving to be as susceptible to blackmail as he initially expected. It's a hard choice, but this might be my favorite Robert Culp killer. All 3 of them share a pompous, arrogant streak that Robert Culp knows just how to play, but here it's even more pronounced. There are the little touches of continually asking to be referred to as Doctor, references to his own work as brilliant, and so many moments where he so obviously is underestimating Columbo, until he finally begins to catch on. My favorite might be when he doesn't turn his car at the intersection, knowing that Columbo was expecting him to instinctively go back to the scene of the second murder he committed, but stops himself. I enjoy it anytime a murderer calls out the traps that Columbo sets for them, and this episode was a treat for that. But there are times where he falls directly into the trap, such as when he is goaded into explaining part of his plan, specifically how he lured the victim into the lobby for a drink of water. I also loved how his character sees all of this as a game, which of course leads to the excellent golf course scene where Columbo delivers the line, "For a while there I thought I was going to spoil your game," to which Robert Culp replies, "Not a chance, Lieutenant." That cat and mouse game was one of the most enjoyable of the series so far to me, and their dynamic dominates much of this episode, at the expense of other characters getting much to do, but I didn't mind that in the least. I think I've given Robert Culp's past 2 characters 4 out of 5 each, but this one must get 5 out of 5. Robert Culp is Columbo royalty at this point. He deserves it, and so does his green suit jacket that also makes its 3rd appearance here. As I'd said, the supporting cast is sidelined a bit more than usual, but everyone does a great job with their allotted screen time. First off, there is Robert Middleton as the victim. I always like Robert Middleton. He's been the bad guy in so many westerns, on TV and in movies, and was the lumbering sidekick to Humphrey Bogart in The Desperate Hours. He plays a rich, stubborn character very well, but as is the Columbo tradition, doesn't stick around very long before being bumped off. Louise Latham as his wife was a very interestingly written and performed character, and what stuck out most was her ability to play being in shock. She's sad at the news of his murder, of course, but it's also tempered by her having been notified of his infidelity earlier that evening. And finally, there is Chuck McCann as the film projectionist that attempts to blackmail his employer after coming to the same conclusion of Robert Culp's guilt that Columbo does. What I enjoyed so much about him is his vulnerability. It could be easy to have him just appear self-serving, not that bright, but thinking he's found a lucrative opportunity. But seeing him realize that he's very quickly in over his head was fun to watch. One side note, NBC Universal was getting a little cross-promotion in with High Plains Drifter posters plastered all over the theater at which he works. 4 out of 5 for this small but effective group of characters. The murder scene is a nicely staged and well-plotted bit of Columbo intricacy. with the salty caviar, the subliminal cut frame spliced into the reel that is being shown, and the tape recorder, time to allow Robert Culp to leave, shoot Robert Middleton, and then stride back calmly for the close of his presentation. I don't have that much to say about it, other than it easily gets 4 out of 5 as well. The ending is very good, even if it's lacking in surprise. I realize they felt the need to educate the audience about how cutting in a frame into a reel of film works, but when it's spelled out so obviously, you know it's going to be used again later, as a bit of poetic justice, using a method that Robert Culp claims to have invented to bring about his own downfall, getting him out of the theater the same way Robert Middleton was manipulated. But despite that, it is still very satisfying. His sitting in the darkened theater, then miraculously having a desire to check his office, only to be caught in the act by Columbo. And maybe there are a select few that wouldn't have understood how it happened, but I think having Robert Culp shout, "A subliminal cut! You use a subliminal cut!" was a little on the nose. Even if Columbo would have just calmly confirmed it, that would have worked so much better. I feel like I can see a producer or studio executive's fingerprints all over that moment. You can't leave any doubt in the audience's mind as to what happened. But I did love that single tear running down his face. And you know that what truly bothers him is that he was beaten, not even that he's being arrested. The whole recalibration barrel thing I'm a little iffy on. I understand that it's used to convert the pistol to a smaller caliber, but regardless, I would assume there would still be gunpowder residue or evidence of the firing pin being used, and I thought it was mentioned that the guns on Robert Culp's wall had never been fired. And finally, I thought it was strange that the whole failed blackmailing motive that kicked the episode off was never really discussed during the finale, what with all the screaming about subliminal cuts going on. But even with these complaints, I still really like the ending. It's got some flaws, so I'll go 3 out of 5, but I wish I could go higher. Robert Culp's performance is practically begging me to, but I'll try to stand firm. Ah! Oh, it's just you. Next up is Publisher Perish, written by Peter S. Fisher and directed by Robert Butler. Jack Cassidy makes his triumphant return to Columbo after having skipped out on season 2, but he was well worth the wait, and he brought a wonderfully villainous mustache with him, playing book publisher Riley Greenleaf. The upgrade from hack writer in Murder by the Book to publishing magnate this time is impressive. His character murders a star author before said writer can make the leap to a rival publishing company. Jack Cassidy is fantastic in the role, and just strictly comparing this character to that of Ken Franklin in Murder by the Book, Cassidy plays Greenleaf with much more subtlety, and is sorrowful and even helpful to Columbo in his investigation, without being too helpful, as many past killers have done. And he is even convincingly shocked when receiving the news of the murder. Throughout the episode, he is composed and believable until the finale when he verges into typical raging killer taking his last swings before being arrested. And that's not a complaint, by the way. It's closer to the opening of the episode, though, where he gets to do his most showy acting, when Greenleaf goes on a big tear, being the most brash, abrasive drunk character you've ever seen, indelibly putting himself in the memories of everyone he meets, which is all part of his plan. I had a great time with Jack Cassidy, and he, like Robert Culp, is going to make off with a 5 out of 5. Amongst the other guest stars are Mariette Hartley, playing an assistant or girlfriend, perhaps, of the rival publisher. She's very good in the role, even if she's very underused. Jacques Aubuchon plays that other publisher, and he is extremely well cast as a sort of quietly gregarious man who is surprisingly patient and kind to Columbo. John Chandler is excellent as the man that Greenleaf hires to commit the murder, a wild-eyed Vietnam vet with a penchant for homemade explosives who has literally written the book on the subject. He was a real treat because he truly feels unpredictable and like he could decide to kill Greenleaf instead, just for the fun of it, rather than go through with what he was hired to do. I get the feeling that Steve Buscemi could have gotten some of his early movie roles because they were looking for a John Chandler type. And finally, Mickey Spillane has a small role as the author who gets iced. Having a real author play one on TV is a lot of fun, even if he's admittedly not a very good actor. It's sort of like whenever you see Stephen J. Cannell make an appearance in a TV show. Acting, that is, not throwing a sheet of paper that magically turns into a logo. It's like, they're not bad, but they never feel wholly comfortable in front of the camera. But regardless, he and the rest of the gang come together as a cool 4 out of 5. There are 2 murders in this episode, and I believe this is the first time in the series where we've had someone outsource the killing to an accomplice, which happens with the first one. For the second go-round, Greenleaf takes care of things personally. I love his plan, even if it's incredibly convoluted. The idea of someone making themselves the most obvious killer, really the only possible suspect, but then crafting the perfect alibi that you claim not to remember, is genius. The whole thing where he yells and stumbles through the bar, throwing a drink, getting into a car accident, and finally getting himself arrested is perfect. The use of split screens throughout that sequence is also quite novel for this show. The murder, though, carried out by John Chandler's character of Kane, is really tense and plays out in near silence. The way he holds the gun, too, in an effort not to disturb Greenleaf's fingerprints, is unusual but memorable. And then later, when Greenleaf poisons Kane, it's also a very good scene. Even without counting that one, the initial crime in question is getting a 4 out of 5. The more elaborate the better, as far as I'm concerned. The finale, too, is really masterfully done. It shows us Columbo at possibly his most theatrical, staging the scene by first bringing in the locksmith and then the manuscript delivery boy. The way in which he forces a confession out of that poor kid is also really well done, in the hallway right in front of Greenleaf, and the way Columbo continually accuses Greenleaf of lying is so fun to watch. But what I loved so much, well, there's a few things. Typically, a Columbo episode will end on one big gotcha. If we're lucky, it's a nice satisfying one. But here, there are 2 levels to snaring the killer. First, there's the fact that Columbo had the lock changed prior to Greenleaf placing a key to that new lock on Kane's keychain. Normally, that would be enough. Cut to credits. But no, there's the even better gotcha of Columbo revealing that the outline that Kane apparently gave Greenleaf 9 months ago matches the story ending that was only dreamt up a week prior to the killing. It's maybe not as instantly iconic as the ending to Suitable for Framing, just describing this ending kind of robs it of the satisfaction that watching it brings, but I still really liked it. And what it does so well is showing the resigned expression fall over Jack Cassidy's face as he realizes the jig is up. It lasts the exact amount of time that you need to revel in Columbo's victory. My main complaint about A Stitch in Crime last season was the abrupt nature to its finale. But Publish or Perish gets it just right. It's really a 4.5 out of 5, but I've decided to avoid half scores this time, so I'll have to round down to 4 out of 5, simply because I don't know if it's up there with the best gotchas in the series. For some other ramblings, the opening credits are another out-of-the-ordinary touch, with explosions cutting to freeze frames as Kane does what's probably his morning routine, blowing up a dozen cars in a gravel pit. Columbo's love of chili rears its head once again during the restaurant scene, all of which was a huge highlight for me. One note I had on that. For the waiter seemingly turning up his nose at the prospect of Columbo ordering the food of commoners in their fine establishment, they sure had a bowl of chili ready in a hurry. And Columbo's shock when he receives the bill, only to have it added to when he reminds the waiter of his iced tea order. And finally, Columbo references the events of Candidate for Crime as a possible idea for a memoir he could write. I don't think this series has dabbled in self-referential territory before, so it was nice seeing Columbo acknowledging one of his past achievements. Overall, a fantastically paced episode that is somewhat overcomplicated, but in the best way possible. I normally write these introductions down, but, well... Mind Over Mayhem was the next case this season, written by Stephen Bochco, Dean Hargrove, and Roland Kibbe, from a story by Robert Sprett. Directed by Alf Kjellin. If you're a fan of Mind Over Mayhem, look out, because almost this whole episode rubbed me the wrong way. To kick things off, Jose Ferrer is the culprit this time, playing a genius of some sort who murders another genius when the latter genius threatens to expose the former genius's son as a plagiarizing faux genius. More seriously, the whole thing takes place at a government research think tank, which is brimming with only the most intellectually gifted among us. Jose Ferrer has a great voice, really resonant, deep. This is the first layer in what I'm hoping turns out to be a compliment sandwich by the end. Only, I think this sandwich is going to have very thin bread and a whole lot of ingredients in the middle. With that out of the way, I found his performance extremely monotone, low-key, and almost disinterested. Where many Columbo opponents are far too eager to help lead him astray, Jose Ferrer's character of Dr. Cahill seems almost bored to tears with the whole charade. As Columbo gets closer to revealing him as the guilty party, you never get a sense of worry or desperation, even in the lead up to the killing. He just goes about it with such indifference. Contrast this with Gene Barry in Prescription Murder, and you realize why that opening sequence is jittery with tension, and this one plays out like an instructional video on how to visit a grocery store. Maybe if you take the character as some sort of unfeeling sociopath, it would work, but I don't get that sense either. It seems this compliment sandwich is going to be open-faced. 2 out of 5, moving on. The ensemble cast as well is largely a flatline. Lou Aries makes for a bland victim, half-heartedly exclaiming that he's going to uncover what Dr. Cahill's son has committed before being run down by a car. Jessica Walter, as his young widow, never seems to realize that she should at least make an attempt at appearing to grieve. Robert Walker is a minor bright spot, as the son who's trying to live up to his father's high expectations, even though he's barely in it. The one saving grace this episode has, amongst the supporting characters, is little Lee H. Montgomery, playing a young prodigy that works at the think tank. He's an interesting character, even though it seems strange that he just lives there without an actual parent or guardian anywhere around. But the best part is that his character is named Steven Spielberg, which has to be a reference to the actual boy genius who directed Murder by the Book. So that was fun, even if it made me wish I was watching that episode instead. For his sake, I'll go 3 out of 5. The murder, as I said, is not so much a hit and run, but a hit and then move the body. And the alibi that Dr. Cahill concocts for himself is lifted almost exactly from Double Exposure, only instead of leaving a recording to simulate live narration, it's switched to a large robot using a computer keyboard to continue the war games going on in the next room. I know it's Robbie the Robot from Forbidden Planet and many other things, but it's not interesting to watch. And when you see the robot clunking away, I find it hard to believe that it's sophisticated enough to avoid hitting 2 or 3 keys at once. Dr. Cahill carrying the body around and leaving a big shoe polish smear felt way too obvious as well. I don't know what else to say about it. Maybe if the alibi plan hadn't been used just 2 episodes ago, I'd be more forgiving, but I'll have to go 1 out of 5. I watched the episode not so long ago, and I'm already forgetting the particulars of it. The finale had an interesting idea, but poor execution. And the idea that Columbo gets is this. If this man killed to protect his son, would he also confess to that murder to protect him? That's a really interesting, logical idea for Columbo to pounce on. And the way he forcefully frames the son for the murder and arrests him was probably the most enjoyable scene in the episode. But the confession itself was entirely underwhelming. Jose Ferrer just goes, "Alright, fine, you got me," or something like that. No suspense, no wrestling with what he's going to do. Well, he stands there looking glum for a few seconds, but that doesn't really get the old heartbeat racing. The fact that Dr. Cahill lit a cigar at the murder scene was another kind of interesting element, but also barely plausible. Apparently, this was done as a failsafe, so that just in case his son got accused, that burnt match that could have only been used to light a cigar direct from Cuba, the kind that Dr. Cahill smokes, coincidentally, would lead the police to suspect the good doctor instead. If that's really the reason, why not leave something a little more concrete? Because in order to convince them of his guilt, he'd probably just have to end up confessing anyway. And the evidence that Columbo finds throughout the episode. The victim has 7 pipes, 1 for each day of the week, so we know he should have his Thursday pipe on him. Where could it be? And the daily odometer log for all think tank motor pool cars, just so we can find 3 extra miles added on. I know these scripts have to be meticulously planned and written, but I prefer for that process to feel invisible to the audience as much as possible. Here, it's like they just tried to come up with the easiest way to lead Columbo to the correct conclusions. A couple of mildly interesting concepts, but I still have to go 2 out of 5. This episode was littered with things that just bothered me. And it almost all comes down to the writing. Dr. Cahill brings up his own alibi, rather than letting Columbo ask him about it naturally. There's dialogue that feels awkward and way too obvious for a show of this quality, like the widow character complimenting Columbo at one point, and other little lines and exchanges that feel clunky. The little kind of running joke about Columbo using a tape recorder instead of his usual notepad is completely unfunny, with an accidental recording of him scolding his dog thrown in. Speaking of the dog, Columbo dragging him along in his investigation was not as charming as the people making this episode seem to think it was. I've got to stop hammering on this one. I really don't enjoy doing it, but it was just completely lifeless, assembled from recycled plot points used in earlier, better episodes in maybe the dullest setting we've seen yet. Again, if you happen to love this one, sorry.
Hello, I'm Johnny. Hello, I'm Tommy Brown, and the penultimate episode of the 3rd season of Columbo is entitled Swan Song.
This episode presents none other than Johnny Cash as the next worthy opponent to go up against the intrepid lieutenant. First off, I am a huge Johnny Cash fan. All the classics I love, of course, but his gospel, the American recordings too, I really do love it all. But that being said, my fandom does not blind me to the fact that he was never really a great actor, despite being cast in a fair number of TV shows and films. But I have to say, he was really good here. At first, I did find him agreeing to play a role like this a little surprising. He's playing a character that does seem very familiar, a country singer who always dresses in black and is known for his gospel music. But then it takes a pretty creepy turn, which, if you've seen the episode, you know what I'm talking about. But as we got to the end of the episode, I think I began to understand why he would agree to take on this part. And in the end, he and the episode as a whole really impressed me. His character of Tommy Brown kills his wife and also a young woman that he was connected to in a plane crash to finally be rid of the blackmail that his wife has been holding over him. But while he is a murderer and has some other low-life tendencies, there is something very likable about the character. I'm sure the writing can be given credit for most of this, but I also have to praise Johnny Cash's performance, because I think this is one of the best arcs that a Columbo villain goes through. And the best part of that is the friendship that Tommy Brown forms with Columbo. Johnny Cash gives the character a jovial, down-home charm, and is notable for maybe being the first bad guy that never really snaps at Columbo, or even gets impatient with him. And that comes from Columbo's strategy of establishing a kinship with Tommy Brown, becoming a united front and bonding over their irritation with Columbo's so-called demanding superiors down at headquarters. The best moment is perhaps when the two of them are brainstorming over what could have become of the thermos filled with drug-laced coffee that Brown discarded prior to the crash. He even calls Columbo "little buddy" several times, and does not do it in a demeaning way. That lighthearted attitude does start to give way and begins feeling forced the farther we get into the episode, and as Columbo is closing in. Especially during the airport sequence. He pretends to absent-mindedly sing to himself and laugh far too loud, and you can tell the pressure has finally gotten to him. It's a surprisingly measured and carefully constructed performance that takes Johnny Cash's real persona and twists it through a lens that distorts him into something else. And because the main guest star is Johnny Cash, we're treated to him singing 2 full songs, I Saw the Light and Sunday Morning Coming Down. The extended runtime on this episode definitely allows time for that as well, but actually didn't feel padded to me this time. Johnny Cash gets 4 out of 5. The guest cast is filled with colorful characters and was largely a real treat. First off is Ida Lupino as the spiteful, controlling wife of Tommy Brown. It's a very brief role, but she sinks her teeth into it right from the opening scene and is better served here than she was back in Short Fuse. Bill McKinney plays her drawling brother, and I really liked him in this rare, sympathetic role. I know him best from stuff like The Shootist, The Outlaw Josie Wales, and First Blood, but here he's truly searching for justice, even if he admits that he's not smart enough to figure out how Tommy Brown murdered his sister, but he's sure he did it. Which brings up another rare instance. Columbo is brought into the case from the beginning to look at one particular suspect and must decide if he's truly worth investigating. John Daner is always a dependable character actor and is a lot of fun as a seasoned, world-weary investigator looking into the plane crash who appreciates Columbo's critical, questioning mind. Vito Scotti is hilarious as an overeager funeral director who is desperately trying to sell Columbo on some preemptive funeral planning. Lucille Meredith is also really good as a seamstress that Columbo goes to for help, constantly tearing down her fellow workers and patting herself on the back for her efficiency. John Randolph plays an elderly, hard-of-hearing Air Force officer who Tommy Brown served under during the Korean War. That scene was also really funny, as Columbo must shout to be heard. And finally, Boss Hogg himself, Sorrel Brook, has a brief appearance as Tommy Brown's manager. A great ensemble, filled with memorable faces, and they easily get 4 out of 5 as well. The murder was really unique, with Tommy Brown drugging his victims in the backseat of his plane during some bad weather and parachuting to safety while the plane goes down to explode. What makes it even better is Tommy Brown trying to hide the evidence and make it back to the crash site before anyone happens upon the wreckage, all on a busted leg. The sequence is very suspenseful and well shot and edited, and the same can be said of the scene where he is first packing his parachute and preparing the coffee. The cuts to speed up his process, and Johnny Cash's almost unreadable face throughout makes for another tense scene. It felt nice for it not to be staging yet another living room while the dead body lays on the floor, so this change of pace gets another 4 out of 5. The finale and the build-up to it is what brings this episode to a really satisfying conclusion. The moment when Columbo first decides to set his trap is fantastic. Tommy Brown is sitting there strumming his guitar, and Columbo just stops and watches him for a while, before making the phone call that puts things in motion. You can see on Columbo's face that he doesn't want to do it, that he wishes Brown hadn't put himself in Columbo's path, but knows it's his duty. Peter Falk sells it so well, and it's a rare, genuine moment from Columbo, when so much of his character, particularly in front of his prime suspects, is spent using subterfuge. But he does make the call, luring Brown to go and retrieve the parachute that still remains hidden. And then he emerges from the trees, only to have his own headlights shining on his face. And Columbo simply walks over and takes the parachute from him without a word. I love how he then explains how he manipulated Brown into coming back here, and how he says he asked the police officer that drove him here to leave him alone with Brown. And finally, when they sit together in the car as I Saw the Light plays once again, Tommy Brown admits that he probably would have ended up confessing because the guilt was getting to him. But Columbo already knows that, because as he says, any man that can sing like that can't be all bad. And then the image freeze frames while the song continues to play. It's a really quiet, somber ending and manages to salvage the power of this gospel music. The episode opens really cynically as these people who masquerade as bringing a crusade around the US are shown as being materialistic connivers. But when all of that is pushed aside, there is truth that they, and Tommy Brown especially, can't deny. And I think that is why Johnny Cash agreed to play this part. The redemptive arc that Tommy Brown goes through. There are funny moments. Columbo's fear of flying comes back into play. The squirrel chili scene too. But in the end, the episode has a very moving, wholesome message. The ending does bear similarity to that of Any Old Port in a Storm, but I enjoyed it far more here. The more typical gotchas are a ton of fun to watch, but this was something a little different, and I loved it. 5 out of 5. A Friend Indeed brought this season to a close, with another script by Peter S. Fisher, and directed by Peter Falk's old pal, Ben Gazzara. For Columbo's final case of the season, he's up against 2 killers. But whereas the pair of murderous spouses in Dagger of the Mind work together on one homicide, initially, the 2 criminals here each commit their own murder, of their wives, incidentally, and then recruit each other to help cover everything up. It's almost a Strangers on a Train style crisscross. But then again, not really. The first murder is committed by Michael Maguire's Hugh Caldwell. And who does he go to for assistance? None other than the Deputy Police Commissioner, Mark Halperin, played by Richard Kiley. And when the Deputy PC decides to off his own wife, he knows just who to help him establish an alibi. Michael Maguire's character is definitely sidelined for much of the episode, so I won't discuss him that much. His character is meant to be a nervous, somewhat sniveling coward, and really only does what he's directed to do after Halperin enters the picture. Richard Kiley's portrayal of Halperin, though, is excellent. The idea of pitting Columbo against his own superior, and one who knows full well what Columbo is capable of, is a great one, and they utilize it fairly well. At the same time, it really does end up being a case of Columbo taking on a wealthy, powerful killer and continuing to prod at him until the closing minutes unravel everything, which is Columbo's typical MO. Richard Kiley is an actor I'm not that familiar with, but he makes for a very cunning, even scary villain, with no remorse for his actions. I can only assume Halperin and Caldwell are really, really close friends because he pretty well jumps at the chance to implicate himself in the first murder, even redressing a corpse and staging the whole scene. I don't really have any complaints with the performance. I'm just not sure I'd place it in the top echelon of Columbo adversaries, so I'll go 4 out of 5. The guest cast isn't exactly stacked, but there is one performance that I loved. Before I get to him, You've got Rosemary Murphy as the unfortunate Mrs. Halperin, and I never could get a real handle on whether the Halperin marriage was a desperately miserable one, or just with some resentment regarding her wealth. I guess the outcome would indicate it was pretty bad, but I didn't really get that impression from her performance. Eric Christmas is fun in his brief role as a snooty jeweler that Columbo visits. John Finnegan comes and goes as robbery detective Duffy, but it's Val Avery as the career criminal Artie Jessup that stole the show for me. I loved him as the shady private detective in Season 2's The Most Crucial Game, and he once again brought this amazing authenticity to his role as a man who's been in prison off and on for so many years and yet continually goes back to crime. His scene in the bar with Columbo is great, first flying off the handle about potentially being a suspect, but then being convinced to help Columbo catch the real killers by the end. That scene is also shot really well, starting in a wide shot and continuing for a long, unbroken take as the camera pushes in on the conversation. I'll go 3 out of 5 just for his stellar work once again. The first murder happens off screen, but we do get to witness Richard Kiley's staging of the scene to make it appear as though it were a burglary gone wrong. What makes it so engaging and unique to watch is the sense you get that Halperin is coming up with what he needs to do on the spot, without weeks or even months of prep time like some of this show's bad guys allot themselves. You see him first scratching the locks to get in, but then the way he carefully drapes the dress over the chair, stealing the jewelry, using his knowledge of police procedure and investigation habits to account for as many potential clues as possible. The second crime, in which Halperin drowns his wife in the bathtub, happened far too quickly for me. Not the murder itself, but seemingly with not enough build-up. I get the motive he's trying to imply, that of making his wife appear to be a witness to the first killing in a press conference, but again, I never got the sense that their marriage was at the point where he would ever consider murdering her. Yes, she had held the purse strings in their relationship. She was rather cold to him, but even knowing those things, it still came out of nowhere when he walks over and shoves her head under the water. And finally, his having Caldwell toss a supposedly live woman into their pool to drown seems like a stretch for the police to believe. She wasn't knocked unconscious and somehow is dead by the time he jumps in to save her. How he ever thought Columbo wouldn't know she was dead to begin with was a little too much of an underestimation. I'll go 4 out of 5 for the first cover-up alone. Beyond that, I was left a little underwhelmed. The final scene is very good, even though the gotcha itself is, and perhaps was meant to be, predictable. The setup of all the clues that Columbo uses to determine their guilt was very well done. The ring left on Mrs. Caldwell's finger is highlighted, but not lingered upon earlier in the episode. The stolen jewels being fakes as well is also a thread that dangles throughout. The torn jacket sleeve being used when staging Mrs. Halperin's death, and finally, the bubble bath being found in her lungs. That line about her using bubble bath as armor is a really nice setup as well. The one aspect that makes the killer being a cop unique for the show is how he has access to seeing a police file, in which Columbo plants the incorrect address for Jessup. Once he looks at that, you just know he's being led to the wrong place to frame Jessup for the crimes. That Columbo rented the apartment himself, I did not expect, and why the need for his own family photographs to be left there, I didn't understand the necessity of, but it's still a very satisfying conclusion. 4 out of 5. Whenever an actor directs an episode of an established TV show, I always take special interest, because you often get a feeling that they're trying out filming techniques that have been on their mind for a while and run wild with them if given the opportunity. Ben Gazzara's direction is no different, where he uses extra tight close-ups than normal, some handheld camera work, and even interesting blocking that feels outside the usual style guide for the show, if it had one. The locations, too, take us outside the usual elite, wealthy settings that Columbo finds himself in, particularly the bar where Jessup hangs out. The scenes set on the street as well are filled with non-actors and feel less polished than is typical for the show. This one did feel slightly overlong to me. The problems with Columbo's car, his dropping a cigar in the commissioner's back seat, and several other moments are charming but feel a little like padding. I will admit that I do get a little less excited about episodes when the culprit is played by an actor that I'm not that familiar with. When it's an A-list actor or someone who was the star of their own show at some point, I'll always be more drawn to those, because it's fun to see someone that's usually been the protagonist in their own films or series able to sink their teeth into a villainous role. But overall, a really interesting episode and a good choice for the season finale. And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, the definitive ranking of Columbo Season 3 from worst to best. The absolute worst this season, and possibly one of the worst in the series, is Mind Over Mayhem, coming in with a dismal 8 out of 20. Next up, we have our first tie on the list, with this season's first 2 episodes, Lovely But Lethal and Any Old Port in a Storm, both finishing with 12 out of 20. And now things start to get a little tighter. Thankfully, over half this season was really great, so now it's just a matter of generally sorting them from great to most great. Which brings us to A Friend Indeed with 15 out of 20. A very good episode, but also one that doesn't contain a lot of surprises or distinguishing factors. It's Columbo at its most dependable, which puts most other shows to shame. Double Exposure is up next with 16 out of 20, and I'm sorry to say it's the last time I'll be seeing Robert Culp in the original series. He'll be back in 1990, I believe, but that's a ways off, judging by how fast I watch Columbo. Our next tie is between Candidate for Crime and Swan Song, which both came in at 17 out of 20. Very different episodes with very different foes to go up against Columbo, so I'd be happy with those as a double bill. Which leaves none other than Publish or Perish to take the top spot at 18 out of 20. It's fantastic. And if Jack Cassidy's character of Riley Greenleaf ended up being charged with murder, then Jack Cassidy himself should have been arrested for theft, because he stole this episode. I'm sorry, I'll see myself out. There you have it. Another season watched and ranked for posterity. Going forward, the seasons will be getting shorter. Not that 8 episodes each was that big of a commitment anyway. Maybe I'll get through the next season faster than I did this one, but no promises. I've got a lot of shows I'm in the middle of, and movies to watch for that matter. And just when I think I've got enough shows on the go, my wife and I will start watching something like Zorro. Guy Williams is a great Diego de la Vega. What can I tell you? But anyway, if you've made it to the end of this, I hope you've enjoyed it, and that my opinions haven't rankled the Columbo purists too much. No matter which order you put them in, it's classic television. They do not make shows like this anymore. Thanks very much for watching. Adios for now.